Good morning, biology class. Welcome to a little online lecture. Um, Hopefully, you all are doing well, you all are safe. And yeah, let's get started. So, today, this would be your introduction lecture to what we're going to be studying second semester. We've talked about it a few times already, but now we're going to go back through and kind of do a little recap of first semester, and that will lead us into second semester. So, if you remember, first semester, we studied a few things, and these things I call the parts of life. So, we did not study what it meant to be alive, but we looked at living things and said this is what they're made up of. The first thing that they're made up of is molecules, and we looked at proteins, we looked at lipids, we looked at carbohydrates, we looked at nucleic acids, we looked at their monomers, we looked at their polymers, how they went together using dehydration synthesis, and we went from small things to bigger things. The second thing we looked at was organelles. How did those molecules work together to make organelles? And examples of that: mitochondria, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the smoothie you've got the rough you've got vacuoles, you've got all kinds of different organelles that work together based on the molecules that build them up. And then the third part of life is the completion of what are all these organelles doing. They're working together to keep cells alive. And specifically, organelles are working with eukaryotic cells. The prokaryotic cells, they don't have organelles, but they still have a lot of those molecules. So organelles aren't necessarily essential for life, but they do make it more efficient and they make it better. So when you look at all of the parts of something, that's like looking at a bike and saying, oh, there's a seat, there's some tires, there's some pedals, there's a frame. All the parts by themselves are not very interesting, but when you put all those parts together and actually look at what they do, that's where the interesting thing happens. And so we're going to look at how do you put those parts together in order to accomplish the processes of life. So we're going to be looking at these three key ideas this semester. The first one is, how do these living things get and use energy? The second one, how do these living things reproduce? And the third thing is, how do these living things interact with the environment? In order to understand those processes, you do need to know what molecules are, you do need to know what organelles are, and you do need to know what cells are. So all of those parts, looking at those structures, now we're going to find out what their functions are. And you're going to see that their structures and their functions go hand in hand. So we are going to look at biological functions in second semester. This is kind of the big idea. Biological function. So when I say biological functions, function, I-O-N, those are all of the functions, all of the things that living things do in order to stay alive. And I'm going to save you a little history lesson. When we get back to class, I'll share that history lesson with you. But for the sake of time, I'm going to pass that for now. How biological function has been studied in the past has really been broken down into two categories. Really three categories. The first category is you just looked at something and said, hey, how does this butterfly fly? How does this butterfly mate? How does this butterfly do anything? And you just observed from the outside world. And while that is interesting, it's not very helpful to really understand something. If you look at a cell phone and say, how does this cell phone work? And you never open it up, well, you're not going to figure out a whole lot. There'll just be a lot of mystery there. So biologists tried to uncover those mysteries, and they uncovered those mysteries by working in two different ways. The first way is they did something called biochemistry. And biochemistry is where you are trying to identify one part that makes the rest work together. So a biochemist is trying to isolate one specific thing that makes the butterfly fly. So it's one part, and how does that control everything else? And their goal is to look at proteins. So biochemistry, if you're a biochemist and you're saying, how does this butterfly fly? Well, first, you're trying to isolate one thing out of that entire butterfly. And by one thing, I don't mean its wings or its muscles or its brain. We're talking all the way down at the molecular level. So you take your butterfly and you blend the butterfly up, you smash it up, puree it, and you make it one homogeneous solution all the way through. And from that solution, you try to pull out the particles, the molecules that make that butterfly work. And there's a lot of good that can come from that, but you can see that it's kind of messy. And you might isolate a bunch of things, but you don't know specifically what that one thing does. Given enough time, you can find out when you start interacting with the living butterflies again, but that takes a long time. The second way that biologists have studied biological functions is by looking at genetics. And genetics is trying to find how one thing is different. Everything else is the same, but one thing is different about some living thing. So going back to your butterflies, you have a whole population of butterflies that's all flying around, but this one that you notice is not flying. So what is different about this one? So that one thing, we'll call that one thing a mutant. So that one mutant is not able to do what the rest can. So why is that? What causes that? And a geneticist will study genes. It took a long time to figure out what genes actually were, but they knew it had something to do with heredity. And when you said, here's a butterfly that can't fly and here's a butterfly that can fly, and I'm going to get them to mate and look at their offspring, and you find out that some of their offspring can fly and some of them can't, or all of them can't, or all of them can, then you start to ask more specific questions and make a whole bunch of different types of butterflies and try to find out all of the different ways you can have mutants that keep your butterflies from flying and try to draw some conclusions from there. And those two different methods worked. They were able to learn about proteins, learn about genes, but they didn't really speak to each other because they were trying to isolate different things. In about the 1970s, there was late 60s, early 70s, there was a revolution in biology, and this was from Watson and Crick, where they discovered the structure of DNA and found out what DNA really was. And so, DNA is the thing that connects your genes to your proteins. So DNA connects genes to proteins, and there is, because your genes, the structure and order of your genes, determine how your proteins are formed. And so how that DNA works, what its processes are, what its shape is, what its structure is, it connects these two. So when that happened, there was a huge revolution in in biology, that allowed the advancement of our understanding of how biological function happened. And so this triangle, this pyramid, is what we are going to be looking through for a little while. So we have a function. What are the proteins involved? What are the genes involved? And how do those genes build those specific proteins? There's a lot that else would go into this, and the historical perspectives, but that's kind of the gist of what we're going to be doing. And so hopefully that gets you thinking and getting you processing what we're going to be looking at. I will be attaching other things for you to consider as well, but this is the gist of what we're going to be doing.